The wind had been blowing since dawn, hot, steady, the kind that carried red dust for miles across the Arizona plain. By midday, the sky had turned a pale, chalky white, and the sound of the wind was the only thing left to keep Margaret Hale company. Her ranch sat alone between two flat mesas, a widow's patch of stubborn land, half-dead cornstalks, and one skinny mule that looked as tired as she was. She'd buried her husband 3 years ago after a raid near the river crossing. Since then, she hadn't had a visitor that wasn't carrying either a sermon or weapon. That morning, she was hauling a bucket from the well when she saw something, a dark shape slumped near the dry wash beyond the fence. At first she thought it was a coyote, or maybe a calf gone astray. But then the wind shifted, and she saw a small hand move weakly in the dust. Margaret froze. The stories she'd heard about Apache raids were enough to make anyone's blood run cold. Never trust the stillness, her late husband used to say. If you see one, there's 20 more in the rocks. Still, she couldn't just leave a child to die in the dirt. She took her rifle from the porch and walked toward the wash. Step by slow step, boots crunching over gravel, sun burning her neck. When she reached him, she saw that the boy couldn't have been more than 10. His skin was burned and dry, his bare chest cut by thorns, and his right leg was bleeding through a strip of torn cloth. A small necklace of carved bone hung from his neck, and his dark eyes, half open, looked at her with something between fear and defiance. Margaret knelt down, keeping the rifle close. "You understand me, boy?" she said softly. "You hurt bad." The boy tried to move, but pain stopped him. He whispered something in a language she didn't know. "All right then," she murmured, glancing at the empty horizon. "Ain't no one coming for you right now." Against every bit of her better judgment, she lifted him into her arms. He was light as a sack of grain, his body burning with fever. As she carried him back to the house, she half expected an arrow to come flying from the hills. But nothing stirred except the wind. Inside, she laid him on the cot by the stove. The boy's breathing came fast and shallow. She cleaned his wound as best she could, wincing when he flinched. "You hush now," she said. "I ain't gonna hurt you. You just lay still." She boiled water, crushed some herbs she remembered from her husband's old medicine pouch, and prayed it would be enough. By nightfall, the fever broke. Margaret sat by the window, staring out at the silent plain. The boy slept fitfully, whispering names in Apache. One of them she thought might be his mother's. When the moon rose, she stepped outside and looked toward the distant ridges. Somewhere out there, she knew, men were missing their son. And if they came for him, they wouldn't care that she'd saved his life. Still, when she looked back through the window and saw the boy's small chest rising and falling, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She whispered to the wind, "If I'm wrong for this, Lord, then you'll have to forgive me." The desert gave no answer, only the long, low sigh of wind against the stones. But far beyond the ridge, in the shadowed canyons, someone had already seen the smoke from her chimney. And by dawn, word would reach Chief Nanton that his son, Taza, lived, and was being kept by a white woman in the Valley of Dust. The desert was quiet the next morning, too quiet. Even the wind had lost its restless edge. Margaret stood by the doorway, holding her coffee tin between both hands, eyes fixed on the horizon. The boy, Taza, she'd learned, was still asleep inside, though he stirred now and then, murmuring words she didn't understand. All night, she'd dreamed of hoofbeats. She'd woken 3 times thinking someone was outside, only to find nothing but shadows moving across the porch. But the feeling lingered, that she was being watched. By mid-morning, she went out to check the fence line. The mule trailed behind her, swatting at flies. She paused at the far post and found something that made her blood run cold, a small mark carved into the wood. A symbol. It wasn't fresh, but it hadn't been there yesterday. Her husband had once shown her similar marks, Apache trail signs. Warnings, messages. She glanced toward the canyons, and the skin on the back of her neck prickled. Inside the house, the boy was awake. He sat on the cot, eyes wide and alert, his small frame tense as a bowstring. The firelight flickered against his face. "You understand me now?" she asked gently, setting down the coffee tin. "You can speak?" He hesitated, then said in halting English, "You, white woman." "That's right," she gave a small smile. "And you're Apache." He didn't answer. His gaze flicked toward the window. "You hungry?" she asked. He nodded once, barely. Margaret poured him a small bowl of beans and cornbread. He ate slowly, watching her the whole time, like a caged animal waiting for the trap to spring. When he finished, he set the bowl down carefully and said something that made her heart tighten. "My father will come." Margaret stopped moving. "Your father," she repeated. He nodded. "Chief Nanton, he come." She felt the words like a stone dropped in water. Nanton. She'd heard that name before. A fierce Apache leader, known for raids along the border. Men spoke his name with both fear and respect. She exhaled slowly. "Well," she said, forcing calm into her voice, "he'll find you alive, thanks to me." The boy didn't reply. She turned toward the stove, pretending to busy herself, but her mind was racing. If what the boy said was true, his father might already be tracking them. That night, Margaret barred the doors and windows, though she knew wood and nails meant little against men who could move like ghosts. She loaded her rifle and kept it by the cot. The boy slept again, fitful, whispering in his language. Around midnight, the wind changed. It carried the faint smell of smoke, not hers. Margaret stepped outside, her shawl tight around her shoulders. To the north, near the ridge, she saw it. A small flicker of firelight in the distance. One campfire, maybe more. Her stomach turned to ice. She went back inside, closing the door quietly behind her. The boy was awake again, eyes wide in the dark. "They're coming, aren't they?" she whispered. He didn't answer, but his gaze told her enough. Margaret sat down beside him, the rifle resting across her knees. "You tell your father," she said softly, more to herself than to him, "I mean no harm. I just couldn't leave you to die." Taza watched her for a long time, then whispered something under his breath, a prayer, maybe. Margaret closed her eyes. Outside, the desert was alive again. The wind rose, carrying with it the faint beat of distant drums, so soft it might have been only her imagination. But deep in her heart, Margaret knew the truth. By sunrise, she wouldn't be alone anymore. By dawn, the wind carried a whisper of movement across the plains, the kind that only a rancher or a soldier would recognize. Hoofbeats, distant, steady, deliberate. Margaret heard them before she saw anything. She froze at the window, one hand clutching the edge of the curtain. The boy, Taza, was already awake. He stood by the corner, silent and watchful, his small fingers gripping the edge of the table. "They're coming, aren't they?" she murmured. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all, calm, certain, unafraid. Margaret stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the rising sun. The desert stretched endlessly before her, shimmering with heat and light. Then, just on the horizon, she saw them. A dark line of riders moving in a slow, perfect rhythm. At first, there were just a few, maybe 5 or 6. Then the shapes multiplied, spreading out like a storm rolling over the land. 50 men, maybe more. Apache. Margaret's throat tightened. She stood her ground, though her knees wanted to give out. The last time she'd seen that many armed men was during the war. Only this time, there would be no cavalry to come riding over the hill. She turned back into the cabin, heart pounding. "Taza," she said quickly, "you stay inside, you hear? Don't come out till I tell you." The boy's eyes followed her every move. "They not hurt woman," he said quietly. "If woman help." "I'm counting on that," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. She went to the chest by the door and pulled out the flag her husband had kept, a white cloth tied to a broken stick. She stepped onto the porch and raised it high. The wind caught it, flapping it weakly in the dry air. The riders slowed as they neared the edge of her land. They fanned out in a wide arc, dust rising around them. Margaret could see their faces now, painted, hardened, eyes sharp as arrows. At their center rode a tall man with a chestplate of bone and a single eagle feather in his hair. His expression was unreadable, but his posture carried the weight of command. He was Nanton, the boy's father. He dismounted slowly, each motion deliberate. 2 other warriors followed him, rifles slung low across their backs. Margaret swallowed hard and stepped down from the porch. Her boots sank into the dust. The chief's gaze moved past her, toward the cabin. "My son," he said, his voice low and measured, his English rough but clear. You have him?" Margaret nodded. "He's inside. Hurt bad when I found him. I did what I could." For a long moment, Nanton said nothing. The only sound was the wind rattling through the dry grass. Finally, he motioned, and one of the men brought forward a painted horse. A symbol, Margaret realized. A gesture. She took a breath. "He's alive," she said quietly. "But he's weak, needs care. If you take him too soon. You speak too much," one of the warriors snapped, stepping forward, but Nanton lifted a hand. Silence fell. Nanton's eyes, dark and deep, held hers. "You did good," he said at last. "But this not your fight." "It became mine when I found him bleeding in the dirt," she replied, her voice trembling but steady. "I wasn't raised to leave a child to die, no matter whose blood he carries." For a second, something flickered in Nanton's eyes, something like respect, or perhaps sorrow. He turned to the others and spoke in Apache. Then he looked back at her. "You bring him. We go." Margaret turned toward the cabin, her steps heavy. Taza was standing in the doorway now, eyes wide, clutching a small wooden carving he'd made. When he saw his father, his lips parted. "Ada," he whispered, "Father." Margaret's chest tightened. She knelt beside him. "Go on," she said softly. "He came for you." The boy hesitated. "You come too?" Margaret shook her head, forcing a smile. "No, son, my place is here." He studied her face for a moment, then stepped outside. Nanton reached down, lifting his son into his arms with a gentleness that broke something deep inside her. As the war chief turned to mount his horse, he met Margaret's gaze one last time. "Wind woman," he said slowly, "you have heart of fire. My people remember." And then they rode away, a thunder of hooves fading into the desert. Margaret stood alone in the dust, the white flag limp at her side. The silence that followed was heavy and endless. But somewhere in that stillness, she thought she heard a whisper, the echo of the boy's voice carried on the wind. And for the first time in years, she let herself cry. The desert was quiet again. Too quiet. After the thunder of 50 horses faded into the horizon, all that remained was wind. The same lonely wind that had always haunted the dry mesa valley. Margaret stood there long after they'd gone, the white cloth still hanging limply in her hand. Her breath came slow, uneven, and for the first time in years, she didn't know what to do next. Inside, the cabin felt emptier than it ever had. The little wooden toy horse Taza had carved still sat on the windowsill, its edges rough, one leg uneven. He'd left it there without meaning to. Or maybe he had meant to. Margaret ran a thumb over the carving. She remembered his small hands shaping it, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. He said it for his father, she whispered. To bring him home. The irony bit deep. She spent the rest of the day moving like a ghost, sweeping, tending the stove, pretending life still had its rhythm. But the silence pressed on her, heavier with each passing hour. As dusk bled across the desert, she stepped out to the porch again. The light was soft, gold melting into crimson across the mesas. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw movement near the fence line, a shimmer of color where the dust drifted low. Her pulse quickened. There, hanging on one of the fence posts, was something that hadn't been there before. A small bundle wrapped in tanned hide, tied with rawhide string, and marked with a single black handprint. She approached slowly, every instinct cautious. The air smelled faintly of sage and smoke. Inside the bundle, she found a few items, each one deliberate, symbolic. A necklace of turquoise and shell, old and worn but beautiful in its simplicity. A smooth river stone painted with two figures, one in a blue dress, one in war paint, standing beside a single sun. And a feather. An eagle feather, white at the base, tipped in black. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She'd seen enough of the world to understand what those things meant. The necklace was protection. The stone was unity. Two people from different worlds under the same sky. And the feather, that was respect. The highest kind. She sat down on the porch step, the bundle cradled in her hands. For a long time, she didn't move. When the wind picked up, it carried faint echoes, a sound like a drumbeat, like hooves on faraway ground. She closed her eyes and let the tears come. The grief wasn't just for the boy. It was for everything. For her husband lost to fever, for the years spent alone fighting the dust and the dark, for the way the land took so much and gave so little back. But this time, there was something else beneath it. Something softer. Hope. She rose slowly, her knees stiff, and carried the bundle inside. On the mantel above the hearth, beside her husband's old Bible and the photograph of him in uniform, she placed the feather. It didn't look out of place. Somehow, it belonged there, a bridge between what she'd lost and what she'd found. That night, she built a fire and sat in its glow. Shadows flickered across the room, soft and alive. She spoke into the silence, voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Nanton, for trusting me." The wind outside shifted, moving around the cabin like a living thing. It brushed against the shutters, sighed through the cracks, and in it she thought she heard a child's laugh, light, fleeting, carried away into the desert night. Margaret smiled faintly. For the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. When she finally went to bed, she left the window open. The air was cool and clean, scented faintly with rain. Before sleep took her, she looked once more at the feather gleaming in the firelight, a promise that even in this hard, merciless land, compassion could still take root. And though no one else would ever know the story behind it, the desert would remember. Because out there, under the endless sky, two enemies had met, and left as something closer to kin. 3 weeks had passed since the riders vanished into the red horizon, but the desert had a way of holding on to memory. Every dawn brought the same chill wind through Margaret's cabin, the same golden spill of light across the floorboards, and the same quiet ache where a small boy's laughter used to be. She'd taken to tending her chores with a steadier rhythm again, milking the goat, patching the roof, mending clothes she'd long ago stopped wearing. But there was something different in her now, a kind of calm strength. On the mantel, the eagle feather still stood upright beside her husband's Bible, catching the light each morning like a watchful eye. The townsfolk of Dry Mesa had noticed the change too. When she rode into town for supplies, they whispered as she passed. Some still didn't forgive her for sheltering an Apache child. Others just nodded politely and stepped aside. But old Doc Howell tipped his hat with a soft smile. "You did a good thing, Margaret. Not many would have had the heart." That night, as she rode home, the sky felt different, low, heavy, and electric. Out beyond the canyons, thunder rolled like distant drums. By the time she reached her homestead, the wind had begun to howl. The air smelled of dust and rain, of change. She moved fast, securing shutters, pulling the horse into the shed, covering what she could. She'd survived worse storms, but this one had a strange edge to it, something wild and unfamiliar. When the lightning split the sky, it lit up the whole valley, and that's when she saw them. 2 riders on the ridge. Not Apache this time. White men. One wore a black hat, the other carried a rifle slung low. Rustlers. She knew the kind. They prowled through abandoned claims and lonely ranches, scavenging what the law couldn't reach. Margaret's hand went to the shotgun behind the door. She'd only fired it twice since her husband's death, but her fingers remembered the weight. The wind screamed as the riders drew closer, rain spitting in streaks across the yard. She stepped back into the cabin, heart thudding, and waited. Moments later, the door banged open. The man in the black hat grinned through the stormlight. "Evenin', ma'am. Fine place you got here. Shame if it got caught in the wind." His partner laughed, a low, mean sound. "Ain't nobody for miles. Guess we could help ourselves." Margaret's voice was steady. "You best turn around now. This is my land." Black Hat tilted his head. "You and what army?" The first shot came fast. She fired above his shoulder, splintering the doorframe. The noise cracked like thunder, echoing off the canyon walls. The men ducked and cursed. "She's crazy," one shouted. But before they could move again, another sound cut through the storm, sharp, piercing, wild. A cry. High on the ridge, a torch flared, then another, and another. Margaret froze. Her heart slammed in her chest. The flicker of fire spread across the ridgeline in a wide arc, a circle of light, like stars come down to earth. 50 torches, maybe more. The rustlers spun, swearing. What the hell? Through the rain, the figures appeared, Apache warriors, silent, faces painted for war. The one in front rode a tall white horse, feathered lance glinting in the lightning. Nanton. The rustlers turned and ran without another word, their horses crashing into the dark. Within moments, they were gone, swallowed by the storm. Margaret stood in the doorway, drenched, trembling, unable to speak. The Apache chief didn't move closer, just sat there in the rain, eyes fixed on her cabin. After a long silence, he raised his hand, open palm toward her. Then he pointed to the feather still visible on her mantle through the window. A flash of lightning lit his face. For just an instant, she thought she saw the faintest hint of a smile, proud, knowing. Then he turned his horse, and the torches moved with him, vanishing into the night like ghosts. When the thunder rolled again, the valley was empty. Margaret sank to her knees. Rain poured through the open door, washing the dust from the floorboards. The storm had passed, but she knew it had brought something with it. Peace. Not the kind the world wrote in treaties or spoke in sermons, but the quiet kind, built between two hearts who had once been enemies. She rose, closed the door, and whispered into the storm, "Thank you, Nanton, for keeping your promise." Outside, the last echo of hooves faded into the wind, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt the desert wasn't watching her, it was protecting her. Morning came soft and golden after the storm, the desert washed clean. Margaret stood by her cabin window, coffee steaming in her hands, watching the mist lift off the canyons. The world looked new again, the air cool, the earth shining, even the wind quieter somehow. In the yard, the broken fence leaned a little more from the storm's fury, but the house had held. She'd held. And though the night's thunder still echoed in her chest, she felt something deep and peaceful humming beneath it. That afternoon, when the chores were done, she sat at her table with a piece of paper and the pen her husband once used for ledgers. It had been months since she'd written to anyone. Years since she'd written to her son. The last letter he'd sent from Tucson had been short. He joined a freighting company, too busy for the ranch, too far for visits. He didn't understand why she stayed alone in the desert. He'd told her to sell the land, move closer to town. But he didn't know what this place had given her, not until now. She dipped the pen in ink and began, the words slow at first, then flowing like the river after rain. "My dear Samuel, the desert has changed. Maybe it was always changing, and I just never saw it until last night. A storm came through. The kind that shakes the windows and reminds you that God still has thunder left. I thought I'd be alone through it, but I wasn't. There were eyes watching from the ridge. You remember when I wrote about the Apache boy? The one I found hurt out by the canyon? His father came for him weeks ago. He didn't come with hate like I feared. He came with honor. I thought that would be the end of it. But last night, when trouble rode to my door, it was that same father who sent his warriors to drive it away. He didn't speak a word. He didn't have to. His son once called me mother, and in a way, maybe that made me kin. So you see, Samuel, this land still holds goodness. Even where men once met as enemies, something new can grow. I don't know if you'll ever understand why I stayed here, why I couldn't sell the ranch or leave your father's grave. But last night, when I saw those torches on the ridge, I knew this was where I was meant to be. If you ever come back this way, you'll find more than dust and fences. You'll find peace, the kind built quietly, between people who decided not to hate anymore. Tell your wife I still keep the Bible by the hearth. Tell her the coffee's always on, and the desert's gentler now. Your mother, Margaret Hale." When the ink dried, she folded the letter carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and sealed it with the small wax stamp her husband once used for cattle contracts. The act felt heavier than it should have, not with sorrow, but with meaning. She stepped outside into the sunlight, the earth still soft beneath her boots, and raised her face to the wind. Somewhere out there, she imagined Nanton and his son riding through the high country, the boy's laughter echoing through the canyons. Margaret smiled. The wind carried the sound of distant hooves, or maybe just her heart remembering. She walked down the dirt path to where the old telegraph line ran, a wire stretching all the way to Dry Mesa. The town stage would pass by in 2 days. She'd give her letter to the driver. Before heading back, she paused at the fence line and noticed something glinting among the sagebrush, small, white, and perfect. It was another feather. New, clean, left there on purpose. Margaret bent to pick it up. The wind shifted softly, curling through her hair like a whisper. She didn't cry this time. Instead, she tucked the feather beside the first one on her mantle, 2 feathers now, side by side, like 2 souls that had met across a river no one else could cross. As night fell, the desert sang, Coyotes calling in the distance, the wind sweeping through the grass, and somewhere in that sound was a promise. The world can heal, if you let it. And in the flickering firelight, Margaret smiled, not as a widow anymore, but as a woman who had seen the frontier's hardest truth and softest mercy. The years slipped by like wind over sand. Seasons came and went on the Hale Ranch, spring rains, long dry summers, winters when frost painted the windows white. Margaret grew older, her hair turning the color of the desert moon. But her spirit never faded. She kept the ranch small but alive, 2 milk cows, a few hens, a horse named Glory she'd raised from a foal. The land had grown quiet, peaceful, and in its silence, she'd found a rhythm that suited her. Sometimes she'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset stretch its colors across the canyon. And on the mantel inside, 2 white feathers still rested, untouched, unforgotten. She never told many about that night, not the boy she'd saved, nor the father who'd spared her life. Some stories, she believed, belonged to the wind. Then, one summer morning, something changed. Margaret was tending the garden behind her cabin when Glory lifted her head and whinnied toward the ridge. She straightened, hands shading her eyes, and saw movement far off, a lone rider, dust trailing behind. Travelers sometimes came this way, drifters, traders, or ranch hands seeking work. But this one rode straight, unhurried, as though he knew where he was going. When he reached the fence line, he dismounted and walked his horse the rest of the way. He was tall now, lean but strong, his hair long and braided in the Apache way, tied with a strip of leather. His eyes, dark and calm, caught the sunlight. Margaret froze, her breath catching. For a moment she thought she was seeing a ghost. Then he smiled. "Mrs. Hale," he said softly. His voice carried both English and something older in its rhythm. "You remember me?" Her hands trembled around the basket she carried. "Taza?" she whispered. He nodded once. "Taza." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, silence thick between them. Then Margaret stepped forward and reached out, not hesitantly, but as a mother might. "My lord," she breathed, "look at you." He laughed quietly, a sound full of warmth. "You have not changed," he said. "Only your hair." "And your height," she answered, smiling through tears. They sat on the porch while the sun climbed higher, and Taza told her stories, of his tribe, of the mountains where he'd grown into a man, of his father, Nanton. When she asked about him, Taza's smile faded just a little. "He died 2 winters ago," he said. "He was old. He said the land had forgiven much." Margaret's heart ached gently. "I'm sorry," she said. "He was a brave man." Taza nodded. "He told me about you," he said. "About the white woman who saved his son and faced death without fear. He said you were strong in spirit, that your heart was bigger than the desert." Margaret blinked away the sudden sting of tears. "He saved me too," she whispered. "More than he knew." From his saddlebag, Taza drew something wrapped in deer hide. He set it gently on her lap. "My father said this belonged to both of you," he said. Margaret untied the leather and unfolded the cloth. Inside lay a small carving, a smooth piece of cedar shaped into 2 feathers crossing each other. She ran her fingers over it, tracing the careful knife lines. "It means," Taza said softly, "2 worlds meeting in peace." Margaret swallowed hard. "Tell me, Taza, do you still ride the same country?" He smiled faintly. "Sometimes. But the world changes. Fences rise where buffalo ran. Soldiers talk more about peace than war now." She nodded slowly. "And you?" "I teach," he said. "Children. I tell them about the old ways, and the new ones. My father wanted that." Her eyes softened with pride. "You grew into a good man." Taza looked at her then, not as a boy remembering kindness, but as a man honoring something sacred. "You gave me life," he said quietly. "You gave my father faith again." He said you were the bridge between his heart and the world beyond the canyon. Margaret couldn't speak. The tears that came weren't from sorrow, but from the deep, quiet joy that only time could bring. As the sun began to set, Taza rose. "I must go," he said. "My people wait by the river." Margaret followed him to the fence line. "You'll come back?" she asked. He turned in the saddle, eyes warm. "The wind always returns," he said, "and I ride with it." Then he touched his hand to his chest, the Apache sign for respect, and rode toward the horizon. Margaret watched until he disappeared among the red rocks, dust curling behind him like a memory. When she went inside that evening, she placed the wooden carving beside the 2 feathers on her mantle. 3 now. Like a promise kept. And when the wind sighed through the window, it seemed to whisper across the years, a language older than words, carrying the voices of those who had once been strangers and left as kin. The sky over the desert changed that year, slower, heavier, like an old beast too tired to roar but unwilling to sleep. Clouds gathered often but rarely broke. The wind carried the smell of rain that never came. Margaret Hale felt it in her bones, not just the shift in weather, but the turning of her own time. Her hands had grown frail, her movements slower, but her spirit, that quiet flame that had seen her through widowhood, war, and peace, still burned steady. Every morning, she rose before dawn, lit the fire, and poured coffee for one. Then she'd step onto her porch, look toward the canyon, and whisper, "Thank you for another day." It was a habit born of gratitude, not loneliness. The land had given her more than most folks ever found: meaning, peace, and a kind of love that didn't need to be named. And lately, when the wind moved through the mesquite, she thought she could hear faint laughter, the echo of a boy's voice, carried from long ago. That evening, the storm finally came. Thunder rolled like distant drums across the mesas, and lightning cut jagged lines through the sky. Margaret secured the shutters and brought the animals in close. The old mare, Glory, nudged her shoulder, uneasy with the rising wind. "It's all right, girl," Margaret murmured. "We've seen worse." But as she spoke, a deep unease settled over her. The wind wasn't just fierce, it carried a strange note, almost like a call. She went inside, stoked the fire higher, and reached for the carved wooden feathers Taza had left. The 3 pieces, the 2 white feathers and the wooden cross feather carving, rested side by side on the mantle. She ran her fingers over them, smiling faintly. "Seems you were right, Nanton," she whispered. "The wind remembers everything." By midnight, the rain came hard. It pounded the roof and filled the dry creek beds, washing years of dust away in a single breath of heaven's fury. Margaret sat in her chair near the fire, wrapped in a quilt, listening to the rhythm of the storm. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. Her mind drifted, not to sorrow or regret, but to the faces that had shaped her life. Her husband, long gone. The boy she had nursed back to health. The proud father who had ridden out of the storm one night and spared her life. And finally, the man that boy had become, standing before her years later, carrying both his father's strength and her own kindness. Margaret closed her eyes and whispered into the sound of the rain, "If you can hear me, Taza, I'm grateful. You kept your father's promise. You lived with peace." A flash of lightning filled the room, and in its brief light, the feathers gleamed, white against the dark wood, glowing as if alive. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, wild and mournful, like the cry of the earth itself. And then, slowly, it softened. When morning came, the storm had passed. The rain left the desert transformed. Every stone glistened, every cactus held drops of silver light. Birds sang again, cautious but bright. Taza returned 3 days later. He had come to bring his people through the valley for spring grazing and decided to visit the woman he still called his second mother. But when he reached the ranch, he found the gate open, the horse still in the corral, and the cabin door unlatched. Inside, the fire had gone cold. Margaret sat in her chair by the window, her face turned toward the canyon. She looked peaceful, as if listening to something only she could hear. On her lap rested a folded note, written in her careful, trembling hand. Taza picked it up and read, "Taza, if the wind carries this to you, know I went easy. I reckon the good Lord doesn't measure a life by how long it's lived, but by what it's given. I had peace here. You gave me back my faith in mankind. Tell your children to remember this land kindly. It holds the bones of both our people, and it holds love, too. Keep the feathers, and when the wind blows from the east, know I'm still here, listening." Taza stood silent for a long time, tears cutting clean paths through the dust on his face. Then, with great care, he gathered the feathers and the letter and stepped outside. The wind rose, gentle now, a warm, whispering breeze carrying the scent of rain and juniper. He looked to the canyon where his father once rode, and then to the sky where clouds broke apart into gold. "Goodbye, White Mother," he said softly. "May the wind carry you home." He buried her beneath a mesquite tree overlooking the valley, the same place where she once watched the sunrise with coffee in her hand. He placed the wooden carving and one feather on her grave. The other, he kept, tied to his horse's bridle. And when he rode away that morning, the feather danced in the wind behind him, white against the red horizon. A small, enduring sign that peace, once found, can outlast even time itself. The desert had changed again. Fences now stretched where wild horses once ran. Telegraph lines hummed with messages from distant cities. Steam wagons rolled along dusty trails that had once been silent as prayer. But the land still remembered. The wind still whispered through the mesquite, and the canyon still held the echoes of hooves long gone. Taza was an old man now. His hair, once black as obsidian, had turned silver, and his eyes, still sharp, carried the weight of both his people and his memories. He had become a bridge between two worlds, the old Apache ways and the slow, unstoppable tide of the white man's world. He had fought once, then he had made peace. And for the last years of his life, he had taught his children and grandchildren that strength was not in vengeance, but in mercy. His youngest daughter, Naish, had her father's calm and her mother's fire. She was curious about the world beyond their camp, and Taza never forbade her curiosity. He had told her many stories, of spirits, of battles, and of one woman who had changed his life before he ever knew what peace meant. Margaret Hale, the white mother of the canyon. When Taza fell ill that winter, Naish stayed by his side. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried that same gentle certainty that had once quieted whole councils. "Daughter," he whispered one evening as the fire burned low, "there is a place to the north, a cabin under a mesquite tree. A woman once lived there who showed me mercy when the world gave me none. When I am gone, take one of the white feathers on my horse's bridle. Leave it there, the wind will know." Naish nodded, her throat tight. He smiled faintly. "She saved my life once, and in time, she saved my soul." Those were his last words. By sunrise, Taza's spirit had joined his ancestors, and perhaps, somewhere on the wind, another spirit met him halfway. Weeks later, Naish rode alone into the desert. The land was harsh and endless, the same sea of stone and sand her father once rode through, though time had softened its edges. Spring had come early that year. Patches of green pushed through red earth, and the river shimmered with meltwater from distant mountains. After 2 days' ride, she saw it, the remains of the old ranch. The cabin still stood, though the roof sagged and the wood had grayed with age. The fence was gone, but a few boards remained, sun-bleached, cracked, but standing, stubborn as the woman who once lived there. And beneath the mesquite tree, half hidden by tall grass, she found a small grave marked by a single wooden cross. Carved into it, still faint but legible, were the words. Naish dismounted slowly, the wind tugging at her braids. She knelt before the grave and ran her fingers across the letters, feeling the grooves like the lines of a story long told but never forgotten. From her saddlebag, she took the white feather, the same one her father had tied to his bridle for nearly 40 years. She laid it gently on the grave. "I bring you the wind," she whispered. "From the sun you healed, and the people you helped him save." The air stirred softly, carrying the faint scent of rain. The leaves rustled overhead. For a heartbeat, Naish thought she heard something. A woman's laughter, faint and distant, like the memory of sunlight. She explored the cabin before she left. Inside, dust lay thick on the floor, but some things had survived. A rocking chair by the window, an old coffee tin, a broken lantern. On the mantel, cracked but still standing, she found something wrapped in cloth. When she opened it, she gasped. It was the other white feather, the twin to the one she'd carried, and beside it, a carved piece of wood shaped like a cross feather, polished smooth by years of touch. She held it for a long moment, tears welling in her eyes. Then, reverently, she placed both feathers together once more, as they had been all those years ago. As the sun began to set, Naish stood outside the cabin and looked toward the horizon. The wind rose, catching her hair, carrying the warmth of the fading light. She whispered, "Two worlds met here, and neither was ever the same." Then she mounted her horse and rode away, the feathers brushing against her saddle, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Behind her, the desert returned to silence, but the wind did not. It carried something soft, almost like words. "Thank you, child. The canyon had gone quiet again. Not the silence of emptiness, but the kind that holds a story. Seasons had come and gone since Naish laid her father's feather upon Margaret Hale's grave. Grass had grown high around the old fence posts. The cabin roof had fallen at last, yet the foundation still stood, firm, stubborn, unwilling to surrender to time. The desert doesn't keep many things, but it remembers kindness. And sometimes, the wind carries it forward. In the small town of Dry Hollow, children still told tales by lantern light. They spoke of a white woman who'd once lived alone in the canyon, a widow who nursed a dying Apache boy when others would have turned away. And they spoke of the day his people came, 50 warriors on painted horses, and how not a shot was fired, because mercy had already spoken. Most thought it was just a legend, but the old ones, those who had seen the world before barbed wire and telegraphs, they nodded quietly when the tale was told. Because they remembered. One spring morning, a rancher rode through that canyon, chasing a stray calf. He saw the cabin ruins and paused, tipping his hat. On the wind, he thought he heard something, the soft cry of a child, a woman's voice whispering his name. He almost smiled, though he didn't know why. He dismounted and walked closer. In the grass near the grave, 2 white feathers lay side by side, clean, untouched by dust, though no bird had flown overhead. Something in him went still. He couldn't explain it, but he felt peace. He fixed the old wooden cross, righted the stones around the grave, and before riding off, said softly, "Whoever you were, ma'am, you must have been someone worth remembering." Then he rode on, never knowing he'd just spoken to history. That evening, the desert came alive with color, the sky burning gold and rose, clouds glowing like embers. The river shimmered, coyotes called from the ridges. And the wind carried voices again. It carried laughter, a woman's laugh, light and surprised. It carried the sound of a boy running barefoot through dust. It carried the deep, calm tone of a man who had once laid down his anger and found his heart again. If you'd stood by that old cabin then, you might have felt it too, a kind of warmth that wasn't from the sun. You might have felt what they left behind. For Margaret Hale, who had lost her husband to war and found grace in mercy. For Taza, who had found his mother's spirit in the kindness of a stranger. And for all who came after, who dared to believe that the land could heal, and so could the people upon it. Their story was never written in books, but it was etched into the canyon walls, sung in campfire whispers, and carried on the desert wind for generations. Some nights, travelers still camp near those ruins. They swear the wind changes when the fire dies low, that it softens, like a hand on your shoulder, that it hums a tune no one remembers, yet somehow knows by heart. They call it the widow's wind. By dawn, the wind moves on, over the mesas, through the dry riverbeds, into the open plains. It carries dust, scent of sage, and a single feather that drifts down onto the trail, white against red earth. A symbol, once given by an Apache father to a white mother of mercy. A symbol that meant peace. And when the sun rises, spilling gold across the horizon, the desert doesn't look so lonely anymore. Because somewhere in that wind, love still rides. Unseen, but never gone.